I'd like to address the question, should Christians practice cremation? The practice of cremation has been rising dramatically in the U.S. In 1960, only 3.5% of people chose cremation. But by 2003, it had risen to 29%. And in 2023, it had risen to 65%. It's no wonder so many are asking questions about cremation. The National Funeral Directors Association has predicted that by 2035, nearly 80% of Americans will opt for cremation. There are many factors that have led to this great change of behavior. One factor in the rise of cremation is the cost consideration. Simply speaking, traditional funerals are expensive, averaging $8,000 for burial compared to less than $2,000 for cremation. And cremation is more convenient. It's simpler for people to say, let's cremate, and then we'll have a service when we can. And people don't want to think about death. Traditional funerals force them to think of their mortality. Another factor is the environmental concern. Roughly 1.5 million burials means Americans are using thousands of tons of copper and bronze and steel, and over 800,000 gallons of embalming fluid, and millions of feet of wood, not to mention the land use. And to this, we are an increasingly transient population. People have often moved so many times that they don't have an attachment to any particular place anymore. But a serious concern for Christians is the unprecedented shift towards secularism. In 2021, only about 47% of Americans belong to a church, compared as recently as 1999, when over 70% of adults stated they were affiliated with a religious institution. This surge in the number of Americans who no longer identify with any religion has contributed to the decline of the traditional funeral in the U.S. and the rise of cremation as the disposition method of choice. Those who are non-religious are the most likely to consider cremation for family and friends. So how should we as Christians think about the subject of cremation in contrast to traditional burial? Does the Bible address the subject? And are there any biblical prohibitions? Well, it may be a comfort to some that the Bible does not directly address the subject. Certainly, there isn't sufficient biblical instruction for me to say, "Thus saith the Lord." But there are some serious points to consider, and perhaps the implicit evidence will be sufficient to direct Christians away from cremation. It has been the practice of Christians dating back to the church fathers not to cremate the dead. The reason the Bible doesn't address cremation is because it was never practiced. That alone should get our attention. There is nothing Christian about cremation. Burial is the biblical practice. Abraham was buried, Sarah was buried, Rachel, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Joshua, Eleazar, Samuel, David, John the Baptist, Ananias and Sapphira, Stephen, and of course our Lord Jesus Christ were all buried. And God practiced burial. This should get our attention. When Moses died, we read in Deuteronomy 34, "So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab according to the word of the Lord, and he buried him in the valley in the land of Moab opposite Beth Peor. But no man knows his burial place to this day." Burial is testimony that looks forward to the bodily resurrection. The body sleeps until we receive our wake-up call. Also, we're following our Lord's example in burial, in our expectation of the resurrection. 1 Corinthians 15:20, but now Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who are asleep. Burial is testimony to our respect for the human being and our high view of our body, which belongs to God. Even in death, it's not ours to destroy. Joseph's bones were carried 400 years before being buried in the Promised Land. Wouldn't it have been simpler to have cremated him and then simply carried his ashes? But this would not have been proper. In fact, for a person not to be given a proper burial was considered a great dishonor. For example, Jezebel was not buried, but eaten by dogs. Cremation has historically been a pagan practice. Our theology will influence how we approach all of life's events, be it marriage or childbirth and death. Burial is the vivid testimony to our expectation of the resurrection. We will be raised from the grave. Hindus and Buddhists, on the other hand, believe in reincarnation into an entirely unrelated body. And so for them, the body is irrelevant. But Christians believe in the resurrection of the body. So although there are no explicit commands forbidding cremation, we can see ample evidence for traditional burial.